I think we need to get across to people that this is a similar scale of magnitude as, investment in massive transport infrastructure in this country. Investment in electrical transmission infrastructure is really key to how we live our lives in the 21st century.
Hello and welcome to the Connectology podcast. Here, Roadnight Taylor's influential team of elite connection specialists and their expert guests help you to better understand distribution and transmission network connections and how to acquire them faster, for less cost and at lower risk.
Hello, I'm Pete Aston, a Roadnight Taylor connectologist, and I'm here to talk with Merlin Hyman of Regen and Cleary from Roadnight Taylor. And we're here to talk about the subject of RIIO-ED2 draft determinations. So it's great to have you both on the podcast. So thanks for coming.
Thanks, Pete.
So then, Merlin, could you give us a brief introduction to yourself and to the work of Regen?
Yeah, thanks, Pete. Good to be here. Thanks for the invite. So Regen's goal in life is net zero energy transition. So independent, not-for-profit organisation. I'm the CEO, and we do quite a wide range of work. Really, just looking at anywhere where we feel there are challenges and barriers on that sort of pathway to net zero, where we think we can kind of intervene, address those barriers, and that might range from problems for people accessing the grid to, lack of diversity in the sector, to the role of local players and local authorities. So a wide range of activities, but all with that kind of golden thread that's about how do we get on that path to net zero energy.
Super duper. Thanks, Merlin. And Catherine, could you just give us a very brief intro to the sort of work you do and your background as well?
Yeah, cheers, Pete, and lovely to be here. So I'm another one of Roadnight Taylor's connectologists, and I look again at lots of sort of low carbon technologies connecting to the grid, sort of how we can get things connected faster, more efficiently, and loved Merlin's recent post on LinkedIn in response to RIIO-ED2 determinations, which is probably a little bit of a dry topic, but I think quite an important one, right, Merlin?
Absolutely, and as you say, not an easy one to sort of get away from jargon and get into. We've already slipped into RIIO-ED2, isn't it? It's already 99.9% of the population would have no idea what we're talking about already. So you can. It's a really critical thing for all of us, but it quite quickly gets into complexity and detail, which makes it perhaps difficult to get the scale of progress. And maybe that's one thing that we could touch on. By the way, Connectologist, very good name. Well done. Presumably that comes from mixologist and
our drinking problems.
Yeah. Well, I wasn't going to put it that way. I was going to say, is there a bit of a kind of cocktail theme going on at Roadnight Taylor?
I think that makes it sound very sophisticated, not just a sort of pint after work type crowd.
I think one of the reasons that I was asked to host this particular podcast was that only 18 months ago or so I was working for Western Power Distribution, where I had the responsibility of pulling together part of the ED2 business plan, mostly on the sort of network reinforcement side of things. So I've got some background with it on that side. And Catherine, I know that you've had a little bit of involvement in business plans before. Do you want to just sort of let us know the sorts of things that you've been involved with before with business plans?
Yeah, so I suppose going back a while now, the previous regulatory period, which was called ED1, I helped one of the DNOs prepare their business plan for that. And I suppose more holistically, I work quite a lot with local authority clients and occasionally with central government as well, looking at sort of big picture questions about how we fund infrastructure. And I'm constantly reminded, I think Merlin sort of picked this up, that we live in a world of jargon where ED1, ED2 means quite a lot to us, but it's a really small world, that kind of grid world, and it's not something that you'll ever see a BBC News report on the kind of lack of investment in transmission infrastructure, whereas we constantly see BBC News reports on investment in transport schemes, HS2 or maybe like road schemes. So I think we need to get across to people that this is a similar scale of magnitude as, investment in massive transport infrastructure in this country. Investment in electrical transmission infrastructure is really key to how we live our lives in the 21st century. So it's a huge topic, and one that I think we just need to do a bit of a better job at breaking down for people.
Okay, thanks for that, Catherine. I think opening out the ED2 planning process is really important, and actually getting everyone in the industry and sort of wider afield as well to understand this is very significant, because there's billions of pounds of money at stake for development into the network. So Merlin, just turning to you, I know Regen's involved in quite a lot of the business planning process in sort of various different ways. Can you sort of just give us an indication as to where Regen has been involved in business planning?
Yeah, thanks, Pete. I mean, just stepping back a bit and pick up on Catherine's point about the importance. I mean, the one thing, if you take everything that we need for net zero, so renewable storage, heat pumps, EV chargers, electrolyzers, the one common feature of all of it is it's all got to connect to the grid. And probably might be not stretching a point, say the one common feature of all of those things is that there are challenges with connecting to the grid. So if we think we've achieved a lot in the last few years, particularly in renewables, starting to see in things like electric vehicles, but we're really just at the start of a kind of the net zero transition. The amount of stuff that we're going to need over the next 10, 15, 20 years to kind of make this journey and bring all the benefits to us of getting off fossil fuels and lower bills potentially, all of those benefits. The grid is on the critical path. So there's various aspects to that grid, with big, little, medium sort of scale stuff, if I can put it in very non-technical terms. But the DNO, the distribution network, is increasingly critical, of course, you know also well, as we get more decentralized electricity generation and as we use it in different ways to get ourselves around and to heat our homes as well as to power our devices. So that kind of led Regen in its quest to facilitate the net zero journey into the question of grid, and we've been really working on it for a decade now and slowly learning more and more. And I guess at the heart of what happens on the grid is not the only thing, but is the business planning process, where the network operators say, this is what we think we need to do to have the grid that we all need, the network we all need, the sort of critical electrical infrastructure that's going to underpin our country, energy and prosperity indeed, and then take that to Ofgem. So we've participated in that process. I was on WPD, now NGED, to keep up with the jargons, customer engagement group, kind of scrutinising the process as it went forward. But back before that, quite a few years ago now, it was Regen and WPD that came up first with a process that's now called DFES, Distribution Future Energy Scenarios. And that was our kind of response really to the network operators saying to us, well, we don't really know what's going to want to connect to our grid in the future, so we're not great at preparing for that. And those scenarios are aimed to give the networks a really good set of data and different scenarios of what might want to connect to their network, when and where, and possibly how will it behave, so that they can start to kind of model what that'll look like, and then they can go to Ofgem with plans and say, look, we've looked at what we need. This is where we invest. This is the money we're going to need to do it.
Yeah, okay, thanks for that, Merlin. Yeah, I'm sort of quite familiar with the DFES process, having sort of worked with it. So, it's been great to have in the past worked with the data that you and your team have provided, and then tried sort of molding that into some sort of business plan. And it's a massive task as well, isn't it? There is a lot of data in the DFES models. Sort of moving on from sort of Regen's general involvement, the specific sort of events that have triggered this podcast, as it were your letter to Ofgem. I think it was in August, and then Ofgem's reply back to you in September, and then what Catherine mentioned, your recent LinkedIn post. So that was in response to Ofgem's sort of draft determinations, wasn't it? Which came out, I think it was June of this year, following the DNO business plan submissions in December last year. So can you just talk us through that and sort of just try and tease out a little bit from that what some of your concerns are around those draft determinations?
Yeah, we're only a few days away from the final determinations, from a critical part of this process. And looking at the draft determinations and what basically Ofgem's proposals for how much money the networks will have to, particularly in this case, to invest to enable all our EVs and heat pumps and new renewables and storage and all the rest of it to connect, does get a little bit kind of detailed and into that kind of DFES process, or future energy scenario process. So I think one big problem with this process was that Ofgem didn't set out like what world to plan for. We know we're in a world of transformation. So in the past we had fairly steady state, energy, electricity world, bit of change, but we're in a world of massive transformation. So that's a different. So when you're putting out a 5-year plan, what do you invest against? Ofgem didn't provide really any guidance from that, and so the networks all came up with their own kind of best view, or they chose a particular world scenario from the future energy scenarios. And what Ofgem then, when they did the draft determinations, came out and said, no, we want you all to work to system transformation, which and that's going to be your baseline. Now, system transformation is a very top-down scenario. I don't think it's a very credible scenario for the future. It's a scenario that, when it was done, didn't meet our kind of 2035 carbon budget targets, net zero power by 2035, didn't meet the government's targets for 600,000 heat pumps. It's a world of lots of hydrogen and big top-down world, not a kind of a consumer-led, much decentralized world, which I think most people think is much more real. Yeah, is more likely. Thank you, Catherine. So that's what Ofgem are essentially doing then is saying to everyone, well, your baseline, your plan, the plan which you really, you sort of base your company size and supply chains on, is the UK fails to hit some of its key net zero targets. Now, the Ofgem would say, okay, but we have what they call, more jargon, uncertainty mechanisms. If we get more EVs, more heat pumps, more things than we expected, you can ratchet up investment. I don't know what you guys think, but that seems to me to be a risky way of planning the critical infrastructure. Let's just remember again, this is the critical infrastructure for Britain's net zero journey, for getting off fossil fuels, for tackling high bills. And we're basing the baseline investment is kind of failed to do that. And we're relying on these uncertainty mechanisms.
Which were probably never designed for that level of potential uplift, right, Merlin? So, I mean, I think uncertainty mechanisms in the past were perhaps, where you had development proposals, a new town that you were expecting to come along that didn't come along, but perhaps something else came along, up the road, and very sort of localized changes, not whole sea changes to the level of technology uptake, of solar PV or of heat pumps, as you say. So, potentially Ofgem are making a lot of work for themselves in the future by kind of opening the door to having to assess huge levels of future applications for additional funding.
The idea that we have to have officials sitting somewhere assessing investment proposals, it's just complete is strikes me as unworkable. We know where we're going, so this investment is going to have to happen in the next few years, one way or the other. It's a question of whether it happen now or a little bit, in a few years' time, the scale of investment.
Well, do you think that? How much do you think that is a sort of political strategy? Because I often look at the news in slightly despair and think someone seems to have given Ofgem a remit to not. It feels like perhaps sometimes that the big buzzwords there are there about decarbonisation, but in the detail we are still looking at the pennies and we are forgetting about the pounds, and so we are saying yeah, let's scrimp and save and absolutely not build anything unless we have a completely robust needs case for it in terms of investing in infrastructure. But the cost to that, to the country, seems to me to be, a real risk that we are delaying deploying the technologies which give us clean, cheap energy.
Well, I think that's right. I mean, I just like to say that I don't want to let, DNOs off the hook. I know Pete used to work for them and know and love them, and I work with them a lot, and there's some great people, but it is their responsibility to manage their network and to deliver the requirements we all need, and they shouldn't just be asking for more money. They should be innovating, getting more efficient, and Ofgem as the regulator should be holding their feet to the fire. I think we'd all agree with that, but you can't move the whole energy chain for transport, to take an example, from oil tankers through the Straits of Hormuz into refineries through petrol stations, shift all of that energy transfer into the electricity network without some investment. I mean, that's clearly doesn't make sense. So I think you're right. Ofgem's traditional remit is to keep their bit of customer bills down. And that's what they focus on. And the fact that by keeping their bit of customer bills down, i.e. the network bit, perhaps saving us all £2, £3, £5 a year on our bills, that kind of magnitude we're talking about, real money, definitely shouldn't, let's take it all seriously. But the fact that by doing that, they're blocking us from addressing a problem that's causing our bills to go up by thousands a year. I mean, it doesn't make any sense. So that, I think, is an issue where we need central government, and they're supposed to have been doing this for years, to set out the kind of strategic plan for Ofgem as to what it's meant to deliver and give it a much clearer net zero remit, so it can then adjust and think more holistically rather than just obsessing, if I can put it pejoratively, about its few quid.
Yeah.
And with your sort of the conversations you're having, Merlin, with Ofgem and others, do you see any movement towards that change for Ofgem coming, or is it still quite some distance into the future?
I think part of the problem is that we were in such a challenging position that with supplier failures and bills going up, that Ofgem's, and risks of winter blackouts, that Ofgem's kind of bandwidth to think differently and strategically is limited, because what it used to do was all sensible when we didn't have a world of massive transformation. It was there to protect us all from monopoly utilities making too much money. I think if you listen to what they say now and Jonathan Brearley's statements, that they're definitely at a senior level of have a better understanding of their role in net zero. I think there's a long way for them to go to really operationalise that, and I think it does need that statement from central government, from BEIS, to give them the really clear ministerial steer as to the kind of what they should really be focusing on. I fear not much is going to happen until after this winter, given the kind of current crisis.
Presumably as well, until we get those final determinations, right? I think that we've seen before the last transmission set of kind of funding arrangements were severely and legally contested. So I think we could expect there to be significant pushbacks from the networks if they do get a really downgraded package of funds.
If you're liking this podcast so far, you may want to pop over to the Connectology page on Roadnight Taylor's website and sign up to the Connectology newsletter for much more know-how, insight and thought leadership in electricity network connections. The link to this is in the description. Don't miss out on any of the articles, explainers, videos, webinars and podcasts that Roadnight Taylor's Connectologists share to give you an edge and help you overcome your grid frustrations.
Yeah, it'd be interesting to see what the appetite of the DNOs is to do that sort of thing. I suppose it depends on the extent to which they don't get what they asked for. Because correct me if I'm wrong, but I think the sort of average reduction in the draft determinations was around about the 20% mark, wasn't it, in terms of draft determinations versus what they'd applied for?
Well, the one I was closest to, WPD Engage, was I believe 20% yes, and just another kind of wrinkle in that. Partly the DNO's role here is providing critical infrastructure to localities to kind of meet their, our great cities, our regions that are supposed to be powering our economic growth of the future, to meet their goals in life. And by saying plan for system transformation as a sort of set scenario, rather than take account of what, I don't know, Manchester or Liverpool or Bristol or Newcastle, actually, or Glasgow or whatever, all actually are aiming to do, what they're thinking is you're having a sort of centralized bureaucracy, basically, ignore the democratic wishes of the great, regions and cities of the UK, which I just don't think is a tenable position. So significant cuts on the level of investment. As I say, I think we just need to keep repeating all this. This is not about just handing out money to DNOs or any other utility. Absolutely, they need, and I'm sure they would agree, they need clear regulation and tight controls on what they're doing. But we are going to have to invest in the network to enable the scale of transformation we all want. And if in 2025 someone's bought an EV, been told by the government to buy an EV, and then they go, try and plug it in, and it says, "Oh, sorry, you can't charge for a," that's just not going to work. Maybe occasionally, but people are, what are you talking about? This was the whole idea. You told me to do this. Now I can't charge it. What have you been asleep at the wheel? And I really do fear that what we'll find in a few years is Ofgem will be going, well, everyone should be thanking me because I saved you all £5 on your bill. And everyone will be going, well, no, I'm not thanking you because I can't charge my EV, actually.
Yeah, and I'm not allowed to install a heat pump.
Exactly. Thank you, Catherine.
I think we should also point out, that we see, probably the reason that the three of us feel quite passionately about this is because we do see up close the reality of when those kind of long-term forecasts don't meet with what actually happens, and it can be quite painful when you end up in a situation where we're sort of sitting around thinking, God, this is a grid group which is absolutely past breaking point, and why didn't someone take the sensible investment decision 4 years ago to perhaps even just build it so that there was room to install an additional transformer, or do a kind of a bigger strategic investment reinforcement piece rather than the kind of little bits around the edges. And when those sort of investment decisions are made badly, we end up picking up the pieces. So I think there have been several cases that Roadnight Taylor have been involved in, sort of working with local authorities, exactly there. In Merlin, in terms of local needs, so particular kind of growth towns, maybe like areas where they're undertaking like really significant kind of low carbon activities, but also new housing growth. We're seeing areas which really should have had forecast demand back in the previous regulatory period in ED1. That grid progress hasn't come forward, and we've ended up with situations where you cannot build houses, you cannot build new commercial infrastructure because of the grid constraint. And the government, in response to that, is up in arms about the West London grid constraints, about some of the East Anglia grid constraints, and they are having to basically hand out money anyway to the DNOs. They're having to say, okay, here's a particular new development that cannot access the grid, and that's delaying the deployment of new homes, and therefore Homes England are funding grid works, to facilitate local authorities actually meeting their housing targets. So you've got people writing checks to the likes of UKPN to solve those problems, and they're doing it outside that regulatory framework. So when the regulatory framework is penny pinching, I think we all suffer, and ultimately potentially the DNO still gets a check at the end of the day, but it doesn't happen through the right process.
Yeah. I'd be interested in a moment in Pete's experience of the kind of decision making when he was inside DNOs and how the kind of framework influenced that. But it's worth saying that that this, because I know some people on the call will be involved in smart solutions and flex and that's absolutely part of this. Managing the asset better, understanding much better what's actually going on, coming up with smart, flexible approaches. There's definitely lots of mileage in that. We're starting to see it happen across the country. We've been, in part of that, and that's great. But we're at a point of transformation where you can't just do it through being clever and smart, you do also need more copper and more kit, and we're going to need both of those. So again, this isn't about, it's all about assets and not smart stuff. It's about both. But Pete, just throwing that question back at you. What you're there in a DNO a couple of years ago, and there's a kind of how much do we put into this scheme? How big do we make it, or do we just what's the kind of mindset?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think the mindset is it is very very tied to what you can do is ultimately very tied to the business plan and to the rules. So for example, there were plenty of scenarios where you could see in certain parts of the network that if you could invest strategically ahead of need, it was quite obvious that wouldn't be a stranded asset. It was going to be used by multiple parties, potentially for demand and generation, and yet you couldn't invest ahead of need because unless it was a immediate problem that you could measure. And so is the demand over the rating of the assets in this particular place right now or next year? No. Oh, well, therefore there's no immediate. You can't justify a sort of financial spend request to do that. And I think it was very frustrating actually. Sort of, it did feel quite regularly your hands were tied because you had to either wait for a problem to materialise or wait for a customer to come along to trigger some reinforcement, which in a lot of the cases customers couldn't afford it and simply wouldn't trigger that reinforcement because it was so expensive. So yeah, I think there were lots of times when the rules prevented the DNOs from acting strategically, and you then see the DNOs just doing the very short-term solution to solve one problem. Like, I can do a little bit of reinforcement here to connect this customer, but actually it would have been far better to have done a bigger, better solution on a more strategic level. So yeah, highly frustrating, I think.
Have any of us, Catherine, have any of us here ever come, well, you would know much better than I, both of you, but come across a stranded grid asset? Do these exist? I bet we seem to worry a lot about them. But
yeah. No, I think is the short answer. I would say, Pete?
Well, I don't think so. I mean, if you think back to when the grid was first built in the 50s and 60s, it was built for demand, and it was built strategically to supply places that were going to be growing population centres, and that they were planning on 5-10% per annum growths in terms of electricity distribution growth. So they invested very heavily in network capacity that were actually still just finishing using. So it wasn't potentially used immediately, but it was clearly always going to be used. And of course, that investment in the early grid didn't even think about embedded generation. So there was a whole heap of capacity inherently created in the network that embedded generation is used, and that's been brilliant. So yeah, I think you're right. I think stranded assets are probably very unlikely.
No white elephants.
No.
I think maybe we should coin a term of black elephants. I think we have the opposite, don't we? We have assets which are full before they're built.
Right.
Yeah, and that is the example when you should have invested earlier. Things where you spend years building a needs case, and by the time you've got the permission to invest, you've already delayed people by 5, 6, 7 years, and you've got an asset which is going to be full on day one of energisation. I think those are the cases we perhaps need to. Perhaps we Ofgem do lots of holding DNOs to account. I think we need to hold Ofgem to account where they have made funding decisions which are delaying that deployment.
We're all enjoying having a go at Ofgem and or holding Ofgem to account, which I think I fully agree with. But one thing they have done, I'm interested again in your views, is change the rules for connecting and who pays, and particularly for demand. So that I think you'll correct me if I'm wrong, but from the 1st of April, unless you trigger a high cost threshold, then any reinforcement costs that a new demand connection causes are socialised, picked up by the DNO, covered within the business plan costs. So will that trigger a more strategic approach now, or is it going to trigger a kind of just delay, essentially? We'll just wait and see.
Do you want to answer that one, Catherine?
Well, I think it's really key the timing. So absolutely agree. It was quite a kind of bold step and a really interesting move, and I think it's a good strategy going forwards. But the timing is really interesting because when the DNOs were preparing their business plans, Pete, when you were preparing your business plan, this wasn't even a sort of glimmer on the horizon, was it?
No. So I think Well, I think towards the end of the business planning process, a significant code review had started to become a thing, but of course you couldn't really plan around it because you didn't know what it was going to look like. So yeah, there has been a bit of a timing issue there, I think, with the publication of the significant code review and the draft determinations. I think the DNOs have had to do a lot of scrabbling around this year to sort of rehash plans to try and fit in with what the significant code review will look like. I think the significant code review is going to help DNOs make some more strategic decisions, especially in terms of demand-led connections. So I do think that's really, really very valuable. I think our time is probably coming towards a close. Merlin, I was going to ask you, we've talked about some of the issues with the way some of the determinations and ED2 process has gone. If there was an ideal scenario, what do you think it would look like in terms of allowing DNOs to invest? Would they have absolute carte blanche to do whatever they like, or just interested to sort of gauge what you think would be potentially a best outcome for ED2?
Yeah, I mean, I guess the boat has sailed a little bit for ED2, but we're actually been working on a paper and thinking about the value inherent in our electricity networks and how we can sort of unlock more of it. So it's critical national infrastructure, and giving this a bit of thought. I think the first thing I would say is that that we should have and probably an independent number that's neither the DNO nor Ofgem, which is the requirement, and I think that should needs to be sourced by more of some sort of collation of local ambition matched up with some kind of national framework. Maybe some Ofgem have been thinking about this, and maybe some sort of regional plan. So the DNO should have a clear kind of requirements plan. This is what this locality, given the overall UK energy strategy within that context, are aiming for, and we want the infrastructure to enable us to do that. Okay, and then it's your job, the DNO, to come out with the best way of delivering that. It might be the right mix of smart and infrastructure investment and etc. Then the Ofgems should be there as the regulator, making sure that DNOs are doing this efficiently, their returns are reasonable and holding their feet to the fire. So I think Ofgem should have, either DNO or Ofgem should have any role in defining what the requirement is. And with the whole process of DFARS and more planning energy planning in a local area, I think we're getting the idea that we don't know what we're planning for anymore is most of it we do know. We know how many EVs we're going to have. We know heat pumps. Some questions there, but we have some pretty good idea of the journey to net zero. So I think that's the kind of critical change for me. I think there's also some clearly, if we think of particularly bigger stuff, there's some issues around the whole connection process that we're all becoming very familiar with, and problems up on the transmission network leading to 2038 delivery dates for people to connect, and which seems a bit crazy. But so there's a lot of bigger problems. But yeah, at the business plan place, that structure I think is what we need to look for.
That's absolutely fantastic. I think that's a great place for us to sort of draw to a close. I'm not sure we've solved every issue to do with ED2.
Pretty much, Pete.
So anyway, thank you, Catherine, so much, and Merlin as well for joining me on the podcast today. Hope that you've enjoyed listening, and we hope you'll join us for our next episode.
Thanks very much, Pete.
Thanks, Pete.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Connectology podcast. If you found it helpful, please share it with any of your colleagues or connections you think may be interested. And please do subscribe at Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your content. You can find out more about our services at roadnighttailor.co.uk, link in the description, where you can also sign up to our free Connectology newsletter for more news and thought leadership in network connections. If, during this podcast, you found yourself wondering what it would be like to have a Roadnight Tailor connectologist in your life, please do email laura@roadnighttailor.co.uk to find out how their game-changing skills and insight can change the game for you too.